Pulling up to Mickey D's just for drinks? Oh yeah, that's me. Nothing extra, just perfection and a straw. Coming in hot for the coldest cups on the block. Because there are drinks. Then there are drinks from McDonald's.
Mix things up with any size lemonade or sweet tea for $1.49. Perfect with our classic fries. Price and participation may vary. Cannot be combined with any other offer.
Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
Hey, Joe Moritucci here, and this podcast is proudly sponsored by Weather Call Services. Don't be caught off guard by severe weather. Choose Weather Call.
Hello, everyone. I'm meteorologist Sean Sublitz, and welcome to Across the Sky, our national Lee Enterprises weather podcast. Lee Enterprises has print and digital news operations in more than 70 locations across the country, including my home base in Richmond, Virginia. I'm joined by my meteorology colleagues from across the sky, Kirsten Lang in Tulsa, Joe Martucci at the Jersey Shore. Matt Holliner in Chicago is off this week. Now, we are in the closing days of winter and spring is just around the corner. This means we could still get snow and ice, but at the same time get some strong thunderstorms. If you've ever flown commercially, you know this is the kind of weather that can create headaches. I've got a couple little stories here or there, but what kind of things have happened to you? Kirsten, you have any kind of story about flying and weather?
Yeah, one of the story I'm going to share actually happened somewhat recently. This was Christmas break of last year, so 2022 to 2023. And we were leaving the Tulsa airport right as a really strong cold front was coming through. And it was one of those where, those temperatures just plummeted and ice just went everywhere. And we were sitting on the runway as this cold front came through, and I was looking out the window, and it just iced over. And I was like, whoa, is this safe? Like, are we gonna be able to get out of here safely? Like, is this plane gonna make it up? And we did, but I'll tell you something, it took us a hot minute to sit there and have the plane de-iced. But it was pretty wild just watching that ice form like that on the plane. And like I said, it was one of those things where I was a little nervous as we were taking off, thinking, man, is this going to make it? But it was kind of cool. It was kind of a neat thing to see.
Yeah. So this was October 2018. We were flying from Denver, which we're going to talk about in this podcast, by the way, Denver to Newark. And we were just over Albany, New York. And it was like towards sunset. So it's starting to get dark. Well, pilot comes on and said, hey, we're going to be going through some thunderstorms. We have to go through these thunderstorms to get to Newark. So we're like, okay, fine. So you start going, then you're bumping around, typical kind of turbulent stuff. But then all of a sudden you're getting like a plop and you just like free fall. Felt like you're on one of those frog hoppers. You just go down where you get the pit in your stomach, that little feeling in your stomach coming around. So I'm like, holy crap. I said, this is kind of crazy. So going around now, it's getting dark and all you see are the flashes of lightning. Like we must be in the core of this cold front and the thunderstorms with it. And like another 3 minutes later, another like fall down. Like, I don't know how much, you probably fell a couple 100 feet right there. And your stomach again gets that like feeling like you're on a frog hopper or a roller coaster or something. And never felt anything like that where you actually had a drop and you felt it in your stomach flying through and it's dark and you got the lightning. And eventually it made it through to Newark, but it was one of those where everybody was clapping at the end because everybody was just kind of scared. There was a stillness on the plane for those probably 30 minutes or so when you're going from Albany down closer to New Jersey. By the time we got to the airport, it was dry there. But it was just, again, to have that kind of feeling on the plane was just kind of incredible. I'll also say this too. One time this was for a story, a Press of Atlantic City story. I did a piece on the people who pulled a banner plane. So if you go to the beach, even sporting events, they have those little banners with the planes. So there's an airport by Atlantic City. It's called Woodbine Airport, super small, but you're flying on one of these basically 2 or 4 seater planes. It feels like you're in cellophane wrap on these planes. I could not handle it. My stomach was not doing so hot, a lot of churning around in there, dizziness. I couldn't handle it. I'm like I thought I'm going to throw up. I'm like, geez, I'm going to throw up in this like 4-seater plane with the pilot who's 19-year-old in front of me, just flying it like no big deal. So I'm like, hey man, like I'm not feeling good. He's like, okay, no problem. And he just like radios in. And he's like, we're landing. And he just like takes it around and just lands at the runway. And I'm like, this would not happen at Newark Airport. Like, it's just so funny when you're at these super tiny airports. Like the runway is just like so free and open access. Like at Newark, you can't be doing. You know, one person gets sick, they got a doggy bag for you on the row in front of you. Here, they just like, yeah, we'll take you down in 2 seconds, loop around, land, and then they just take right back off. So it's just if you've only flown at commercial airports and then you kind of get into this other aviation where you're going to these tiny airports, you really see that airports are not always as big and chaotic and the lines and all that than at the smaller ones. So that was an interesting story as well.
Yes, I've made good use of a doggy bag once outside of Denver because the turbulence is infamous there coming in and leaving Denver. We'll get to that in a little bit because one of the things we wanted to talk about is all this weather and flying getting to this time of year. So our guest this week is Rob Eicher. He's a meteorology professor at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Florida. We're going to talk with him about aviation weather, what the flying public should know before, during, and maybe even after a flight. Before going into academia, Rob worked on the air as a meteorologist in Boston, Charlotte, and Orlando. He was one of the first 100 meteorologists who earned the Certified Broadcast Meteorologist designation from the American Meteorological Society. So with that, we'll be right back after the break with our conversation with Rob Eicher. So Rob, right off the top, is there any one overarching thing that frustrates you about how commercial airlines are managing their fleets with regard to weather, scheduling, that kind of thing? Or do you think in general they're doing a pretty good job?
Well, keeping in mind that a lot of our students get scholarships from, airlines, I think they do a fantastic job, Sean. Fantastic. No, as a flying customer, there are many times that I've been frustrated. I'm like, how could you have not seen this coming? Like any meteorologist could have told you 7 days ago that you won't want your planes here, you'd want them over here. But there are definitely times when there is nothing that you can do. Like we've talked about this a little bit earlier. Sometimes there's a squall line that covers the entire country, it goes from northern border to southern border, and there's nothing you can do. There's no way around it. And in that case, yeah, you just, as a customer, you just have to be patient. But there definitely have been times when you see a storm coming and you think this could have been probably better managed. That being said, I do think the airlines are getting better about being proactive about that.
So let's say you're in an airport, you're at the gate, and you know how this is nowadays. There are all these monitors up, and there are these weather monitors up. They're showing squall line heading for this airport or that airport. Do you think there's a lot of, or any, value in that to the flying public for people who aren't really weather savvy to look at that and go, oh no, what does that mean? Am I delayed?
Sometimes I wonder if it's up there just as a convenient excuse, if I'm to be 100% honest with you. Because I know for a fact that there have been times when I've been told, oh, your flight is delayed because of weather. And I'm like, no, it's not. But to the other customers on the plane, they're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. I saw that thing up on the wall or on the monitor. I heard there was something about a front or a storm or something. So sometimes I wonder if that is in fact a convenient excuse. For my students, the future pilots, what I actually tell them to look out for most, believe it or not, is not the cold front or the things that get some of the big attention, like the severe weather or hurricanes or something like that, because that's pretty obvious, right? That's coming, to fly around that. But what can often cause a lot of delays is something as simple as a warm front. Warm fronts don't get as much attention in the weather world because they tend to, as you know, not produce as much in the way of severe weather. But from a pilot's standpoint, they produce usually a wide area of low visibility, wide area of fog at the ground, wide area of low clouds, wide area where you've got to worry about wind shear, a wide area where you've got to worry about turbulence, wide area where you've got to worry about icing. So basically everything that you would want to avoid if you're a pilot, all contained in a warm front and over a large area, much larger area than with a cold front. Cold front, it's usually a thin line, and we talked about like you usually get a squall line. But with a warm front, that's usually spread out over a huge region. So I tell my pilots, like, pay attention to the warm fronts, because a lot of times those are the ones that are going to cause you delays that you may not be able to do anything about.
So I'm guessing that's more the ground delay versus so much up in the air. Like we can't put the bird down. We can't get this thing off the ground because the warm front's here. There's this mist and fog, or worse, there's some kind of rime icing going on. Ick.
Right, exactly. The warm fronts aren't as, sorry to use the word, like sexy on TV or on monitors, because they don't look like much, and they don't look like much on radar. But as you point out, they usually produce, low visibility, and that can lead to significant delays because every airport has a certain number of planes that they're allowed to take off and land in a 60-minute period. And the FAA has certain rules for this, and that depends on how good the visibility is, how good the winds are, how good some of the very, very basic conditions. You might look out the window and you think, oh, it's just a little light mist, I can't take off. Well, no, the plane can take off, but there's 15 others out ahead, and they all have to wait longer than they would normally have to wait because the skies aren't crystal clear. And again, with the warm front, that tends to happen over a big area. And then icing is the other concern. So you tend to get more icing concerns, both ground level and in flight with a warm front, which means more time de-icing the plane. So it may not be the type of thing that cancels your flight, but the type of thing that delays your flight for half hour or more.
Hey, Rob, it's Joe. So let me ask you this. You have airports with obviously multiple runways. What determines what runway you're actually going to land or take off on?
The winds. So ideally, the planes want to take off and land into a headwind. Most airports are actually designed based on climatology. So they line up the runways when they're actually built. They line up based on what the prevailing wind is most of the time. And in most cases, there's a prevailing wind, kind of in the winter season, and another prevailing wind in the summer season. So they might have one set of airports that they use primarily for the summer and one set that they primarily use in the winter. But what they decide that day is where the wind is. They don't want crosswinds if they can avoid it.
So just to follow up on that, because how does that process work, right? So you're saying in the morning, there's, it's saying, hey, this is where we're taking off and landing for today. Like what happens, you get the days where a cold front comes through, the sexy cold front coming through, and winds are flipping. So what happens in those situations?
Yeah, they may actually switch runways. Yeah.
They
may actually switch to a runway that's more favorable depending on the winds. It does depend, obviously, on the airport, and in some cases, like here at Daytona International, the commercial jets are limited, obviously, to the bigger runways, and those run more or less north-south here. So even if there's a crosswind, they're still going to use the north-south runway.
Rob, who makes that call? Is that an FAA call? Is there a meteorologist on site? Is that the ATC, air traffic controllers? Who gets to make that call? Like, all right, winds have shifted. We need to start bringing people on this runway, or, flip the runway from 01 to 19.
That's actually a good question. Because I'm not sure, having never actually worked in an air traffic control tower, I'm not sure who gets the final call. I believe it is the air traffic controllers themselves. But you know what? I'll get back to you, because right down the hall here is a whole room, or not a whole room, hallway full of air traffic controllers that actually spent 20 years or so working in towers. So I'll ask them who makes the final call. Usually at the bigger airports, yes, there is actually a meteorologist, a weather observer, and at the bigger airports, 24/7, 365, there's a weather observer actually hired to sit there and keep track of that stuff.
So let's talk, if it's okay, just about some of the features higher up in the atmosphere. So for someone that may be listening to this and thinking, and maybe doesn't have a lot or an extensive knowledge on weather, can you give some of the basic larger features that may cause turbulence? Because everyone wants to know about that, right? They get on a plane, they're like, is this going to be bumpy or not?
Easy, yeah. Over 2/3 of the moderate or greater turbulence, in other words, the turbulence that you're going to feel as a passenger, 2/3 of that is caused by the jet stream. So if you're near the jet stream, you're likely going to encounter some turbulence, so pretty good odds. So very first thing you can do is, look where's the jet stream today. I do it before I fly, and it's fairly reliable. Like I fly a route usually from here for Florida to DC, because my relatives are up in DC, so I fly that route all the time. I'll look and I'll say, oh, well, the subtropical jet's crossing North Carolina today, should be a little bit bumpy over North Carolina. Flight will be nice and smooth. Bump, 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 bump. Oh, we must be over North Carolina. Yep, sure enough, there we are. So yeah, if you know where the jet stream is, you know where most of the turbulence is.
Hey, Rob, just following up on that. So we're recording this on March 1st. So in February, there was a pretty popular story in the Washington Post, Capital Weather Gang, about this plane going 800 miles an hour. And, breaking, or at least it seems like it's breaking the sound barrier. But how does that work? Are planes actually breaking, commercial planes, are they actually breaking the sound barrier when they're going 800 or 825 miles an hour? And would you hear it at the ground?
No, because that's the difference between ground speed and airspeed. Yes, relative to the ground, they are actually going over 800 miles an hour because they're riding in a jet stream that's over 200 miles an hour. So if you're riding with the jet stream, you've got a nice tailwind, and it's a 200-mile-an-hour jet stream, and you're cruising at 500-600 miles an hour, suddenly you're going 700-800 miles an hour relative to the ground. But relative to the air, you're still going 500-600 miles an hour. And to break the sound barrier, you've got to go faster than speed of sound airspeed. But yeah, relative to the ground. And jet stream tends to be a lot faster in the winter months, January and February particularly. So you'll see almost every February, at least a couple of days where there'll be flights, transatlantic flights going from North America over to Europe, or even Africa sometimes, that are setting record times.
Back to turbulence, Rob. I hear a lot about clear air turbulence. I'm going to guess that's mostly associated with the jet stream. But you said before, in places that, there's no cloud cover, it just, to the flying public, it mysteriously becomes bumpy. Could you talk through basically how that works?
Yeah. So most clear air turbulence is a result of wind shear. So you've got winds either changing speed or direction suddenly within a short period of time. So with the jet stream, what happens is you have really light winds over here, and then right next to it, you've got really fast winds. And that sudden change in wind speed causes a little bit of rotation within the atmosphere. And if that little bit of rotation spins down to small enough scales, then you feel it in the plane. You feel the atmosphere actually rotating the wings of the plane, or causing the one side of the plane to go up and the other side of the plane to go down. Now, again, that on the plane level, it has to be pretty small scale. We're not talking the large scale waves that you see in the jet stream. Obviously, that's not going to impact the plane. But if you've got a sharp change in wind direction or wind speed over a short distance, you're going to create these little rotations, what we call eddies, in the atmosphere. And those eddies are what rock the plane.
So we talked about, turbulence. I just want to go back to icing, because Kirsten was talking about this too. You can get icing year round, right? And because it kind of sounds odd, especially during the summer, right? So you get icing, but that's icing that's happening aloft. And how is that happening during the summer? And how high up do you have to go before you're getting icing during the summer?
It depends. But yeah, absolutely. And even here in Florida, and I have to stress that a lot to my students, because I'll hear them say oh, I don't have to worry about icing here in Florida. Yeah, you do. If you go high enough. Now, here in Florida, I can tell you, typically in the wintertime, you may have to go up 10, 12,000 feet mean sea level before the temperature drops below freezing. And in the summertime, you may have to go up 18, 20,000 feet before the temperature is that cold. But if you go high enough in the atmosphere, then eventually you're you're going to get cold enough. On standard atmosphere, the temperature drops 6.5 degrees Celsius per kilometer. So on typical, you're dropping 6.5 degrees every kilometer you go up. So again, it's only a matter of height. Eventually, you're going to drop below freezing. So where that happens, obviously, if you're further north and the surface temperature is only in the 50s, even in the middle of summer, you may only have to go up a couple of thousand feet before the temperature drops below freezing. But yeah, here in Florida, you have to go up about 20,000 feet before the temperature drops below freezing. But commercial airlines fly, at somewhere between 30 and 40,000 feet cruising altitude. So they're up above freezing all the time.
We're going to take a quick break, come back with Rob, and talk about some more things that are good to know if you fly commercially when we continue with the Across the Sky podcast.
Hey, Joe Moritucci here, and this podcast is proudly sponsored by Weather Call Services. Don't be caught off guard by severe weather. Choose Weather Call. Receive precise, location-specific alerts via phone, text, or email. With over a decade of experience, Weather Call delivers pinpoint accuracy for your exact address, ensuring no surprises. So take charge and stay prepared when ominous skies loom. Explore the Weather Call difference today. Visit weathercallservices.com/Lee-Enterprises. That's weathercallservices.com/Lee, Lee-Enterprises, ENTERPRISES. We'll have that link in the show notes too. Safeguard yourself, your business, or any school that matters to you.
And we're back with Rob Eicher, professor of meteorology at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University there in Daytona Beach. Used to work on the air as a broadcast meteorologist for a while too, and has made that transition to academia.
Recovering broadcaster.
Yeah. Recovering broadcast. I have a lot of friends who are recovering broadcast meteorologists. Now, Rob, let me ask you this point regarding weather. You're sitting at the gate, you're looking at the radar on the TV, or you're watching some weather happening out the window at the gate. Is there any kind of weather that looks worse than it actually is?
Probably thunderstorms, believe it or not, because thunderstorms are fairly small scale. And if you're about 20 miles or so away from a thunderstorm, then you're okay. And generally, thunderstorms typical thunderstorm lasts less than an hour. And they also move fairly quickly, except in most parts of the United States, not necessarily here in Florida, where they'll sit in one spot for an hour, but most parts of the United States, they'll move fairly quickly. So you may look on the radar like, wow, I've got a really intense thunderstorm. My flight's probably going to be canceled. Might be delayed, but after that, you'll be fine. Perfect example. I had a flight, and there was actually a severe thunderstorm about 5 miles from the airport. Thunderstorm actually produced a tornado that touched down. We were on the tarmac. We just sat, waited for the thunderstorm to pass by, took off. Flight was fine. Sounds bad, like, oh, there's a tornado 5 miles from the airport. My flight's going to be canceled. Maybe not. Might be delayed, but not necessarily canceled. Yeah.
Let me ask you though, like if you're flying those, like a small plane, not a commercial plane, in Florida, and it's the afternoon in the summer, isn't it kind of like a minefield trying to go through them? Because you're only going a couple thousand feet, and those thunderstorm clouds are higher than where you are, right?
Yes, no, absolutely. Yeah. You can't fly over, even the commercial jets, can't fly over the Florida thunderstorms, because the Florida thunderstorms, the bigger ones, will be up 50, 60,000 feet. So higher than the service ceiling of even the commercial jets. So you're absolutely right. Like you have to Florida in the summertime, it is like you're doing a bit of a maze that you're dancing around. But that's pretty typical, and that's normal. That being said, I don't like that as a flying customer, having to either wait for a thunderstorm to pass or go, be a little bit late because we have to go around a line of thunderstorms or a couple of thunderstorms. So me personally in Florida in the summer, if I can ever, I will take a morning flight just for personal preferences. But usually, yeah, I mean, obviously we fly year round here in Florida regardless. But yeah, if you're on a smaller plane, especially, you're going to feel the bumps.
Yeah, back to scheduling that for that point, going from the East Coast, and let's say I want to go west, and it's January or December or February, In your experience, let's say I had an opportunity to fly from Washington, D.C., and I got to go, I don't know, San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a chance to connect out of, Chicago or
Mm-hmm.
Atlanta. And I'm thinking it's January. Do you know if there's any statistical relevance here or advantage to connecting out of a southern city like Atlanta versus a northern city like Chicago regarding, winter weather, ice and wind and all that kind of stuff? Or is it really just not that big of a deal nowadays?
It's I don't have the stats off the top of my head or handy. I know personally I would probably bet on Atlanta rather than Chicago, but I don't have the stats to actually back that up. But to your point, it's a bit of a crapshoot because yes, it could be that, yeah, normally speaking, Chicago is going to be windier in the winter than Atlanta, and that's true. So it might be a little bit bumpier in Chicago than it would be, say, landing in and out of Atlanta. On any given day, that could change, and that could be totally different. I know personally, I try to avoid flights that connect in Denver, just because the mountain range turbulence or mountain turbulence that you get downwind of Denver. So I try to avoid that.
Talk a little bit more about that, because I'll be
Okay.
honest, the one time I ever got sick on an aircraft, well, I should say twice, coming into Denver and leaving Denver. Talk a little bit about why it's so turbulent, there on the front range of the Rockies in a place like Denver.
Yeah, mountain wave turbulence. So when we talked about clear air turbulence, we talked about how wind shear is a big cause of turbulence. The mountains themselves cause that wind shear. So if you've got strong winds going over the mountains, right? Mountain friction slows that wind down. So by definition, you've already got strong winds up here and much lighter winds down at the mountain level. But the mountains obviously also cause the winds to change direction. So pretty much no matter what you do, you've got a drastic change in wind speed and direction near the mountains. And depending on what's going on any particular day, that can be quite severe, where the winds coming down the mountain may be amplified significantly, and then they actually hit the ground and then bounce back up, and you get all sorts of rotors and weird little turbulence things happening. Think of it like turning on the faucet in the sink up full blast, the water hits the bottom of the sink and then splashes up. Same type of thing can happen on downwind of mountains on really severe, really extreme cases. So yeah, that's some of the worst turbulence is downwind of mountains.
Just going on turbulence, right? So my understanding is turbulence is more just discomfort for the flyer than anything else. Am I correct in saying that so far?
More or less. There have been cases where turbulence actually causes damage to the aircraft, and fairly frequent cases where there's injuries from people that just weren't wearing their seatbelts. So my number one advice is, as silly as it sounds, always wear your seatbelt, even when the seatbelt sign is off, because there could be clear air turbulence that even the pilot doesn't know about or isn't expecting. And as long as you have your seatbelt on, yeah, you're okay. But if you hit big enough turbulence that you bounce out of your seat, then you risk injuring yourself. So there are a fair number of injuries every year caused by turbulence from people not wearing their seatbelts. But to your point, yes, very rarely is there a serious catastrophic failure.
So following up on that, then, is there from a pilot's perspective, and when you're looking at how to get from point A to point B, is there a difference, excuse me, a commercial pilot may take from somebody who's a cargo pilot, or maybe in the military perspective, flying, a plane that way?
Yes, absolutely. So obviously, if you've got a plane full of passengers, you're concerned about the passengers and you're concerned about customer loyalty, right? A customer, as Sean mentioned, throwing up may not be a return customer. So yeah, if you're a commercial flight, you might, say, you know what, I'm going to go around that. But if you're a cargo pilot, you might say, oh, I can save myself 30 minutes if I fly through that. I don't care about the bumps. So yeah, the pilots, depending on what is in their plane, may make different choices. Now, I unfortunately have worked on cases though where even the commercial pilots with the plane full of people still thought we can do that. And maybe that wasn't the best decision. No,
Right.
but generally speaking, yes, the commercial are more likely to go around than say a cargo flight.
Right. And what about this? Like when you're flying, right, like transatlantic or going across the Pacific, once you get out of radar coverage with the weather, how does that change? How does that change from a pilot's perspective and maybe a route planning perspective when it does come to the weather?
Good question. And we have satellite coverage, so we have a pretty good idea. But a lot of it actually is based on pilot reports. So, there may be some unlucky person who discovered turbulence on the transatlantic flight that no one knew existed. But he, reports that, and now every other pilot knows to avoid that particular area. So pilot reports actually are really, really important for knowing what areas to avoid flying in. Even with all the technology we got, sometimes it's just as simple as, hey, we encountered some severe turbulence at this spot, don't fly there.
So I want to ask a question about summertime. There were all these headlines about how it was too hot to take off or too hot to fly in Phoenix.
Yes.
And I was actually a quote unquote victim of that. I was in the air and we weren't able to take off or fly that day. Can you explain that a little bit and how the heat plays a role in taking off or flying?
Yeah. Simply, hot air is less dense, right? You learn that in meteorology school. Hot air rises, cool air sinks. Hot air is less dense. So if the air is less dense, there's fewer air molecules, and then the plane can't take off because the lift depends on air molecules flowing over the wings. So if you have fewer air molecules flowing over the wings, you have less lift, and your plane is going to have more trouble taking off. So in extreme cases, if it's really hot, the air becomes so thin, and that's especially true if you're already at an airport that's at a higher altitude anyway, like Denver or Albuquerque. So if you're already taking off at a higher altitude and it's a particularly hot day, then the air becomes so thin that the plane can't take off. And I can't imagine, because there have been cases where instead of just canceling the flight, the airline operator will ask people to get off the plane to reduce the weight. So can you imagine, like, sorry, we can't take off because plane's too heavy, we need you to get off? Can you imagine being that person? Like, get off the plane, we're too heavy. But yeah, that does happen.
Depends how much that gift card is from
Right,
exactly.
I feel like that would cause a complex.
Right, exactly. Like, we're too heavy to take off, we need you to get off.
So, with that though, with the hotter climate, with the hotter climates, is that something that you can know ahead of time? Like, how would you know if, like, because there's all different kinds of planes, right? Like, how would you know that this plane is not going to work on the runway?
Yeah, no, the planes are certified by the FAA to be able to take off, at certain temperatures. So they know, like, all right, at this temperature, we can't fly. And for some smaller jets, not like the big commercial 737s, those things, but like the regional jets, that may be as low as 118 degrees Fahrenheit or 122 degrees Fahrenheit, which is still high. But again, that's not out of reach in areas like Phoenix.
Right. But with the smaller planes, and I'm asking myself, like, they're lighter, right? So do they need as long of a runway, or is it because the power from the engines just isn't as much either, so it all balances out?
And they don't have the wingspan either.
Okay.
Yeah, so the bigger the wings, the more lift you have. So the smaller jets don't have as much in the way of lift from their wings.
So I like these tiny. I'm going to keep going here because I'm really interested. Now I'm engaged.
Okay.
So
now the first time I said something interesting.
Now I'm really in the zone. So these I'm not talking about like a Phoenix though. I'm talking like your local airport that's in your county or whatever. Like you still have these smaller planes that are flying on what usually are smaller runways. How does that parlay into with these temperatures in states like Arizona or New Mexico, or are these smaller county or smaller town airports have these long runways to compensate for it?
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. If you're taking on a really hot day, you need a longer takeoff rolls. You need more time on the runway, which means you need a longer runway. So building an airport, in the airport planning, they have to take that into consideration. Like, all right, this is a hot climate, we're going to need a longer airport than we would in a smaller climate where we can take off with a shorter takeoff roll. So yeah, they have to take that into consideration. Like the the high extreme temperatures require longer runways.
So go to Alaska if you need a short runway.
If you need a short runway, yeah. But yeah, you'll actually notice it, like at least I do, maybe because I'm like hypersensitive to it. But you actually notice it, like on a cold day versus taking off on a hot day. You'll be on the runway and you're like, is this plane going to take off? Like, it seems like we've been speeding down the runway for a while. Like, why aren't we up in the air? And then eventually it does. But yeah, if you take off on a real hot day, you may notice that it seems to take a little longer than it should to get off the ground.
I have noticed that. I do. I pay attention to that stuff. It's, you see the difference between flying in January and flying in July. Sometimes sometimes I just feel like you're like on the run, like boop, and then going right up.
Right.
At least in New Jersey. Florida, obviously a little bit different, but flying out of Newark Airport, for example, you see that.
Yeah, there's a big difference between January and July in New York.
Yeah, for sure. Cool.
So let's talk a little bit about, on that idea, taking off and landing, not so much those last few moments, but can you talk about what we call the boundary layer in meteorology? Why it tends to be so turbulent, or relatively more turbulent, in that, let's say, last dozen minutes or so and first dozen minutes or so of a flight, leaving that area in the bottom few thousand feet before getting up to flight level. Can you explain to people why it tends to be more turbulent closer to the ground?
Yeah, low level turbulence is the turbulence that we experience within the boundary layer. And the long story short, the boundary layer for I know but for everyone else, is basically the layer of the atmosphere that interacts with the surface. So you get above the boundary layer, the air is flowing pretty smooth, but within the boundary layer, the air is being impacted by surface. That could be anything from mountains, trees, buildings, whatever the case may be. So again, going back to that wind shear, all that stuff near the surface causes a little bit of wind shear, which causes a little bit of eddies. So you tend to get turbulent eddies closer to the surface, and even on fairly light days. And that can also come from thermal turbulence, where you've got real hot air rising here next to some slightly cooler air over here. So that happens in areas where you've got, a really diverse ground, for lack of a better word. So you've got water in one area and then hot pavement in another area. Those are going to heat up at different rates, and consequently, you're going to get hotter air rising over here, cooler air rising over there. And that little bit of difference can also cause some bumps. But yeah, you get usually about 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 feet, and that smooths out because you get above that layer of the atmosphere that's impacted by that surface stuff, the surface heating or the surface friction. Generally speaking, that type of turbulence, that low-level turbulence, is worse in the middle of the afternoon. So 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So if you are a person that wants to avoid turbulence, best time to fly is right around sunrise.
Very good to know. Every once in a while when I've flown, because I don't fly often, but we'll take off and I could see the cloud deck. It's a low-level cloud deck. It's 4,000 or 5,000 feet up. And it might be a broken cloud deck. And I could feel a little turbulence, and I'm looking at that cloud deck like, I can't wait to get on the other side of that cloud deck so this turbulence stops. Yes. And sometimes it just does, and it's almost like magic. And it's one of those things like, wow, this is exactly like they taught me in undergrad. Right. And it's kind of neat to experience that, to go from the boundary layer into what we'll call the free atmosphere, where the effects of gravity and the boundary, the ground, just are not as important. So that's always kind of fun.
I tell my students it's an easy way to make $100 with their flight instructors, because we can usually predict with a decent amount of accuracy within a few hundred feet or so the height of the boundary layer. So I tell them where to go to look and find that, and how to predict that. And I tell them, all right, bet your flight instructor it's going to be a little bit bumpy up to about 3,000 feet, and then I guarantee you 3,000 feet, it'll smooth out. And easy $100.
One of the things, I think all meteorologists do like about flying is you can kind of see the atmosphere in real time, the layers of the atmosphere. You're not just looking at a bunch of computer images, which we love to, but when you're looking at it in real time, you see how do you have cirrus, the high thin cirrus clouds way up above, and you see the puffy cumulus clouds and how thick those cumulonimbus clouds or those thunderstorm clouds are. I'm just asking, like, from your perspective, like, do you still get that like excitement now that you're fully immersed in the aviation weather cross section, or is it just something where it's part of your job now?
There are two types of meteorologists, Joe. There's the type of meteorologist that enjoys flying because they can appreciate being up close and personal with the atmosphere they've been studying their whole lives. And then the other type who is scared to death of flying because they know what it can do to the plane.
I guess I'm in the first one.
Yeah. Honestly, the more I learn, the more I start to see things and think about like what could possibly go wrong. But no, that's me being a bit pessimistic. To your point, yeah, no, it's still really exciting, and it's still like, even just the boundary layer. It's cool to be able to say, oh, I'm going to hit that cloud deck, and I know it's going to smooth out, and sure enough, it happens, and you're like, wow, that's the atmosphere working exactly like I learned in the textbooks, and so you still get some joy out of that.
It's also good to know that most pilots have some idea of what's going on in the atmosphere. I mean, I take a lot of comfort in that most pilots know what they're doing in the atmosphere. I'm not going to sit back there and go second guess them, but sometimes I've seen cumulonimbus in the distance, and I'm like, we're physically going around that thunderstorm. So that's kind of neat to see once you can recognize that. So Rob, let's wind this on down. Where can people learn more about the work you're doing or what Embry-Riddle is doing there in Florida?
erau.edu. Simple as that. Or just Google, Embry-Riddle. We've got we're known as an aeronautical university, obviously. So we probably about 40 or so of our students are future pilots, but the other about 40% are actually future aeronautical engineers. So we actually just launched but some other members of the university over in the engineering department actually just launched a camera to the moon. The Eagle Cam just landed on the moon a couple days ago.
Very nice. One last thing before we let you go. I understand you're working on a little something. What's your research involved?
Yeah, my area of research is actually going back to my previous career in broadcasting. My area of research is focused on weather communication, weather risk communication, specifically hurricane risk communication. So I've been working with the Hurricane Center on some prototype graphics that will hopefully better explain how strong a hurricane could be, kind of the best and worst case scenario. Like, we think it's going to be this strength when it makes landfall, but it could be as strong as this, just FYI. So we're working on some products that communicate that, hopefully in an understandable way. So hopefully, maybe in a couple of years, there'll be a new graphic, something, maybe slightly different than the cone you're used to seeing too, and I'll be able to say, hey, I helped make that.
Rob, thanks for joining us for the podcast. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you guys for having me. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Excellent. We hope to talk to you again soon. We'll be back with some closing thoughts here on the Across the Sky podcast.
Everybody in your crew identifies as either Big Mac Burger, McNuggets, or McCrispy Sandwich. But you're the Filet-O-Fish Sandwich all day. That crispy fish, that savory tartar sauce, that melty cheese, that pillowy bun. Yeah, you get it. Every time.
And if you love the Filet-O-Fish, right now you can catch two of the classics you love for just $6. Limited time only. Price and participation may vary. Cannot be combined with any other offer. Single item at regular price.
Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
Yeah, I mean, it was nice to talk about some of these things, having scheduled flights and gone through flights and the clear air turbulence, which I think a lot of times I'm not even paying attention to. So this is going to remind me before I fly, double check what some of the weather charts say to see where the jet stream is, and if I'm going to be dealing with that at some point during a flight.
Yeah, that's a good advice. I mean, a lot of times, you think everything looks good and, there's no storms around and you're thinking, man, this is just going to be a great, comfortable flight. And then you jump on the plane and one of the first things the pilot says is that you don't get, your soda because it's going to be bumpy, and you're going to, especially, I'll take a lot of these real short flights from like Tulsa to Dallas, or Dallas to down to San Antonio, and then they don't give you enough time to get a beverage, and that's kind of a bummer. So yeah, I got to check the jet stream before you get on the flight.
Yeah, I always look before I hop on the flight. But to me, it's like, I just love flying so much. Like, I don't care what the weather is. I mean, it could be sunny, it could be, cloudy and overcast. I mean, I just love, I really, like I said in the interview, I just like going out and seeing the atmosphere at work. You can, when you're up in the air, you can see, what's happening at the surface all the way up to 30 or 40,000 feet. So it's really cool that way. But Kirsten, you're making me think. So, flying in Tulsa, like, you're in the center of the country. So I guess you really don't have like super long flights. Like, you don't have these coast to coast flights. And if you're on the East or the West Coast, like, if you're going, like, if I'm going to LA or San Francisco, like, there's always enough time to, get drinks and stuff, even going to Florida. But I guess if you're in the center of the country, your flights just aren't, if you're staying in the US, your flights just aren't as long. So you have less of an opportunity for the soda.
Yeah, it's true. I think some of the farthest, that I've gone, it's Phoenix, we're talking 2.5 hours.
Yeah.
But you know what, Joe, let me tell you something. Having a bunch of small kids, it's not bad. When you have a long flight like that, it's they get a little iffy after like an hour and a half. So it's good to have some touchdown, and transfer over, all that stuff.
I remember this little story. When I was going to a conference in Oklahoma City, we had to connect and came from the East Coast, touchdown in Dallas. So it was a very short flight from Dallas to Oklahoma City. And by the time you got up, you were coming back down. So they still tried to serve, drinks, the sodas, and the staff was just like, this isn't a sipping flight. This is a serious drinking flight, meaning that you don't sip your drink, throw it back, and off we go. So I just thought that was kind of interesting. It was a Dallas to Oklahoma City is a serious drinking flight, which is something I will probably remember for a long time. So guys, let's put it to bed for this week. But next week we're getting closer to the solar eclipse, the total solar eclipse, the first one since 2017. So we're bringing back our buddy Tony Rice from NASA to get us all ready for the April 8th total solar eclipse. What do's, don'ts, reminders, all that stuff. If you've forgotten since 2017, where's the best place to see it, where you might see a little piece of it, where you might not see any of it. So he's got us all those bases covered for us. That's next week. Weeks that follow, we're going to talk about weather and the power grid, why you need to conserve power when it gets hot. Top 10 things to know about spring as we get close to astronomical spring. And it's March, which means April comes next. And that's when our friends at Colorado State put out their first hurricane outlook. So we'll be talking about that in April. So a lot. It's funny because we were hurting for a while, but Joe, we've got a busy schedule coming up. Everything is starting to fall into place.
We certainly do. We get into this every once in a while. We're like, geez, we need some new podcast topics. And then whether it's our listeners or just us kind of off the top of our head, we go boom, 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 boom. And then we're loaded up for the next 6 weeks. So yeah, we have podcast episodes ready for you all the way through April 8th episode. And we even got a couple more after that. So we are staying plenty busy here, and we appreciate everyone listening and downloading and subscribing. And if you know someone who likes weather, and you probably do if you're listening to this, probably someone to talk about weather-wise, I'm sure you have, tell them to download and subscribe. We'd really appreciate it.
Yes, please download, subscribe, tell your friends, give us the rating on Apple Podcasts, all that good stuff, because it helps. And if you have a question, you can send it to us via email, podcasts@lee.net. Lee Enterprises is our parent company. So podcasts@lee.net. Just put subject line across the sky. It will get to us. And Joe, you've got the old school phone number, right?
We do. 609-272-7099. 609-272-7099. I am actually going to break news here for Sean and Kirsten. We got a voicemail, but we will talk about it after the show. Maybe we'll chat about it next week on our episode. But we do have a voicemail that I did see in my inbox.
Excellent. Excellent. All right. With that, we will close it up for this week. For Joe Martucci in Atlantic City, Kirsten Lang in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Ed Absentia, Matt Hollander in Chicago. I'm meteorologist Sean Sublett in Richmond, Virginia. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next week on the Across the Sky podcast.
Pulling up to Mickey D's just for drinks? Oh yeah, that's me. Nothing extra, just perfection and a straw. Coming in hot for the coldest cups on the block. Because there are drinks. Then there are drinks from McDonald's.
Mix things up with any size lemonade or sweet tea for $1.49. Perfect with our classic fries. Price and participation may vary. Cannot be combined with any other offer.
Ba-da-ba-ba-ba. Everybody in your crew identifies as either Big Mac Burger, McNuggets, or McCrispy Sandwich. But you're the Filet-O-Fish Sandwich all day. That crispy fish, that savory tartar sauce, that melty cheese, that pillowy bun. Yeah, you get it. Every time.
And if you love the Filet-O-Fish, right now you can catch two of the classics you love for just $6. Limited time only. Price and participation may vary. Cannot be combined with any other offer. Single item at regular price.
Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.